How do you feel about church? Honestly. According to the Barna organization, 1 in 3 Americans are now officially de-churched. That's a lot of people, and you might be one of them. Many people, especially church leaders, are trying to understand why church engagement is declining. And it's easy to blame those who are leaving. People are too self-centered today, or youth sports are taking over Sunday mornings. Christian faith is under attack in the culture. Listen, I'll be the first to admit that there are all kinds of complicated factors here. Heck, I even wrote a whole book about how consumerism is impacting the way our culture thinks about faith. But we can't put all the blame on those who are leaving the church. Josh Packard is a sociologist who's researched this issue. He came to some really surprising conclusions. First, he found that a decline in church involvement was not matched by a decline in religious belief. He wrote this: "People are as concerned as ever about religion and are finding religion in their daily lives. However, the trend across all age groups is to move away from church and religious institutions as the central organizing mechanism for this activity." But here's the part that might really surprise you. Packard discovered that the most spiritually mature people and those who were the most involved with church activities were also the most likely to leave the church. Based on interviews, he found that those who left the church, quote, didn't stop doing things to advance what they believed to be the work of God. They stopped doing things to advance the work of the church. Did you get that? It's totally counterintuitive. Most of us assume it's the least involved and the least mature who are most likely to drop out of the church. But it's not. It's people like me, those who are totally committed to Christ and who have a long history of deep involvement in the church. So what's going on? How do we explain this? Well, I want to propose that we've overlooked something really important. Rather than blaming all of this on youth sports or laziness or even Christian consumerism, we also need to look at cruise ships. Let me begin with some history. In the first half of the 20th century, ocean liners were how most people traveled between Europe and America. We often think of the glamorous first-class passengers enjoying these floating palaces, but in truth, ocean liners served a very practical function. They moved people and cargo from point A to point B. That's why they were called liners. But the glory days of the ocean liners began to fade in 1953 when a comet roared across the Atlantic. The de Havilland Comet was the first commercial jetliner. The fastest ocean liners took about 6 days to cross the Atlantic, but a jet could do it in just 6 hours. And overnight, the vast ocean became just the pond. Many thought passenger shipping would never recover, but they were wrong, because some innovative ship owners thought of a new way for their fleets to make money. Cruises. Rather than the practical purpose of moving people from one point to another, cruises were intended for fun, and they usually sailed in a circle, starting and ending in the same port. This fundamentally changed the purpose of the ship. Before, a ship was a form of transportation, but with cruises, the ship became the destination. That's why modern cruise ships dwarf the old ocean liners. They have to cram so many features on board to attract passengers. Today, megaships have parks, carousels, water slides, whatever these things are, ice skating, roller skating, bumper cars, simulated surfing, simulated skydiving, simulated families, even bowling lanes. I mean, seriously, who goes bowling on a cruise ship? All of this happened because ships went from being vehicles to being destinations. So what does all this have to do with the church? Well, like ocean liners, for centuries, churches had a simple purpose. They gathered people together and transported them into communion with God. That was it. But in the 1960s, changes in our culture started drawing young people away from the church. Baby boomers weren't that interested in connecting with God anymore, and small, simple churches just couldn't compete with the attraction of shopping malls and multiplexes and rock concerts. But some innovative pastors came along with a new idea. If people no longer felt the need to connect with God, then perhaps something else would draw them into the church. The need for community or entertainment or help with their families. In other words, rather than making the church a vehicle for connecting with God, they decided to make the church a destination in itself. They even invented a new word. We used to talk about Christians and non-Christians or believers and non-believers, but starting in the 1970s, we began talking about the unchurched. And since then, the number of megachurches has exploded while the actual number of people attending church has declined. In order to attract people, just like cruise ships, churches have had to get bigger and bigger with more and more features. We now think it's completely normal for churches to include coffee shops, bookstores, food courts, recreation centers, water parks, children's ministries packed with Xboxes and climbing walls, aquariums, and yes, there are even churches with bowling alleys. Seriously, who bowls at church? Now, don't get me wrong. This has all been done with the very best of intentions, and in some cases, those intentions actually work. I'm sure there are people who have entered a church because it has a great CrossFit program and actually found Jesus there. And that's great, but we need to remember that a huge church can survive if you don't find God there, but it can't survive if you don't fund its programs. And that brings us back to the real reason you may be uneasy about church. A lot of us aren't going to church for the climbing wall or for the laser show or the dancing fountains. We're going because we want to meet God. But over time, if we don't find him there, we give up. We're looking for a simple ocean liner to take us into communion with God, but instead we find a sea of entertaining cruise ships that sometimes don't take us anywhere at all. The Barna organization has found that the number one reason millennials go to church is to be closer to God. But it's also the number one reason they leave the church. Maybe it's time for the church to just be the church again. Maybe it doesn't have to be a rec center or a shopping mall or even a bowling alley. Maybe people aren't giving up on the church because our culture has moved away from God. Maybe it's because the church has. If you'd like to read more, check out my ebook, How Churches Became Cruise Ships, a survival guide for the seasick Christian. Don't forget about our weekly podcast with Phil Vischer, and sign up for With God Daily, my daily devotional delivered right to your inbox every morning.